It is my enormous pleasure as director of the Institute for Critical Social Inquiry, my name is Ann Stoller, to launch the 2017 Summer Institute and our public lecture series by introducing and welcoming Professor David Harvey, who's giving one of this year's summer master classes. Those of you interested, please go online, just punch in ICSI and you'll come up with it. His master class this year is on Marx, Capital, the book, the concept, the history, and it's based on a manuscript that should be coming out this year, David? Marx, Capital, and the Madness of Economic Reason. If David is widely considered one of the most influential geographers of the later 20th century, everybody loves quoting that line, I would add less caveats to that accolade. Professor Harvey, one could argue, is the most prolific and widely read and widely heard interlocutor of Karl Marx on our current global political and scholarly landscape. Having taught for years at Johns Hopkins, LSE, Oxford, he has graced our New York scene with his presence at the CUNY Graduate Center for the last 16 years. And most importantly, has made Marx not only relevant to our contemporary world, but insisted with plain prose and with incisive analytic acuity that we can't possibly understand the entrenched and growing inequities in which we so disparately live without the tools that Marx offered. In over 30 years of publications, he's broached the most basic predicaments of our times, from his early books on the urbanization of capital in 1985, with the conditions of modernity, postmodernity in 1991. He shaped, actually, generations of political thinkers in and out of the academy. How we think about advanced capitalism and what constitutes the major features of its transformations. He has single-handedly and with staggering insight offered a conceptual grammar, and I think that's one of the things that's just so powerful about his work, to make sense of these shifts, drawing our collective attention to flexible accumulation, time-space compression, and riveting us not on what he calls the technological fix and what he has long considered an overemphasis on technology, to what matters most, the quality of people's lives subject to and subsumed by capital, with his relentless tracing of the possibility of profit back to the division and alienation of labor. His titles really tell it all, and given the size of our audience tonight, you already know it. But to list a few: Spaces of Hope, Justice, Nature, and the Geography of Difference from 1997, The New Imperialism, 2005, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, published the same year, Social Justice and the City, 2009, Rebel Cities, From the Right to the City to the Urban Revolution, 2012. He places disobedience and dissension and the spaces for them dead center in his work and in the trajectory of his call. David Harvey is more than a public intellectual. His work is a political and conceptual call to arms. With his most recent book, he reminds us that capital is value in motion. And with this crucial emphasis, he invites and compels us to think and act in new directions. He shies neither from helping us decipher the most complex of Marx's insights, nor does he embrace them all, or defer from calling out those which we might think to set aside. If capital is value in motion, David Harvey is value in motion of another sort, without the nefarious consequences. He garners such intellectual and political value because he speaks to the present and to the history of the present, and never lets us forget not only how inequities are produced and how we participate in producing them, but how wasted lives, as Zygmunt Bauman would put it, are not accidental features of capitalism's growth, but constitutive and defining requirements of it. But his narratives are never only bleak. Capital, he reminds us, is innately, I quote, innately revolutionary, but not inevitable in its effects. Subsumption, a favorite term of Marx's, can never be complete. It is incumbent upon us to understand and grapple with how it works and why forging new social relations, as he urges, that redefine the terms of value are the responsibility of us all. So please join me in welcoming David Harvey, whose lecture this evening is entitled Visualizing Capital.
Well, thanks for that. I've had an idea for some time now to try to make Marx's thinking a bit more easy to follow. And in the course of this, it's produced some little strategies to try to help that project along. I wanted to do this because I think that Marx is not a sort of esoteric thinker who is inaccessible. Unfortunately, we academics have often made him much more inaccessible than he needs to be, so I've tried to be a bit oppositional by trying to make him more accessible. And I'm particularly interested in trying to represent, as well as I could, his argument in the 3 volumes of Capital and in the other political economic writings. In doing this, I've had in mind for some time the idea that I tried to come up with a visualization of what it's about. And my inspiration for doing this is the diagram up here, which you're probably wondering why on earth that's there, given this is a lecture about Marx. But it has some interesting features, the water cycle or the hydrological cycle. And of course, as a geographer, I'm very familiar with this and have been familiar with it for a very long time. The great thing about it is that actually H2O goes through a whole series of different forms. Starting as a liquid in the ocean, as condensation becomes a vapor in the atmosphere. It is transported very much faster in the atmosphere all over the place. It then starts to condense and form clouds, and eventually there are forms of precipitation. There are all sorts of forms of precipitation that can occur. Snow, ice, rain. And this precipitation falls on the land and it takes on various paths back towards the oceans. Some of the paths are fairly fast, some of them go very slowly, some of them hardly go at all. Some of it gets locked up in ice caps, and others gets lost underground in large aquifers that don't move at all for many, many centuries until we come along and pump them out for our own particular uses. These transformations of form are what Marx calls metamorphoses. And that's a very important concept when Marx starts to look at what capital is about. Now, as Anne's mentioned, the definition of capital that I use is value in motion. And in exactly the same way that H2O is in motion in this water cycle, so capital is in perpetual motion. And therefore, capital is not a thing. It's not a measurable quantity in the ordinary kind of sense. It's not even a singular process, because in the same way that there are many paths that precipitation can take to get back into the ocean, so there are many paths that capital can take and it's not easy to figure out and be deterministic about which one will happen. So it was on the basis of this water cycle that I came up with the following representation, if I can get this thing to work. Here we are. This is my representation of the value in motion of capital. And let me go through it very briefly because it's not self-evident. It's not as so beautiful as the water cycle one. But capital really begins at a certain moment where somebody takes money and turns it into money capital. And Marx makes a big difference between not all money in society is capital, only some of it is capital, and that some of it is money which is going to be used in a certain way. That is, it's going to be used as money to make more money. So we start then with, at the bottom, money capital. And money capital goes into the marketplace and buys two kinds of commodities, labor power and means of production. Now what this implies, of course, is that when capital starts upon this path, that there is already a money system which is fairly sophisticated and stable. There is already wage labor which can freely be appropriated, and means of production, commodities in the market which can easily be purchased. These are all preconditions for the circulation of capital to begin, and how those preconditions was created is in itself a long and complicated story that Marx partially covers in his theory of primitive accumulation. But for our purposes, we simply then have to look at the way in which labor power and means of production are brought together with a given technology to produce a new commodity. And that new commodity can take a variety of forms, which I'll just come back to in a second, and is then taken into the market and sold for money. And this is an operation that Marx calls realization of value. And that realization then depends upon the ability to sell the commodity in the market. Now this passage from money capital through the purchase of means of production, through production of commodities to the money, effectively shows a series of metamorphoses from the money form to the commodity form to the production form to the commodity form to the money form. And that passage, which I've just been through, actually describes the content of Volume 1 of Capital. Volume 1 of Capital deals with that passage and that passage only. And I want to make clear to you as we go forward that Volume 1 of Capital is only one part of a totality, and what Marx has in mind here and throughout his work is a description of capital as a totality. And it is that totality that interests me a great deal. This moment then of realization of value converts the commodities into the money form. But of course the realization of value only makes sense if there is more money at this point than was there at the beginning. In other words, to go to money capital to get the same amount of money back at the end doesn't make any sense. The only thing that would make sense is for us to go from money capital of a certain quantity to come back with more money at the end than we started with. Which means that the production of commodities is not simply the production of commodities, it's also the production of the basis of profit, which is what Marx calls the production of surplus value. And it is the production of surplus value that Marx calls the operation of valorization. So you start with money capital, it becomes valorized as value and surplus value, and then it becomes realized as money plus the original money plus a profit. So this is the first part of the story. Then once the capital is realized in money form, it is distributed. And it's distributed in a variety of forms, rather like the same way there are varieties of precipitation, so there are varieties of ways in which the money can be split up. Some of it goes in wages. And as wages, it forms the worker-consumer demand that comes back to buy commodities, some of which have been already produced, which are the wage goods which have been produced in production. And those wage goods permit the reproduction of labour power and the social reproduction more generally, which returns labour power back into a circuit, the market. So that part of the distribution part is a very significant framework. And secondly, some of the money is distributed in the form of taxes. Now, Marx actually didn't write much about taxes at all, which is rather strange, given that the primary source of his critique of classical political economy was Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. My hypothesis as to why he didn't deal with taxes was simply that, as he records in the Grundrisse, he had the idea that one day he would write a book about the state, and obviously if he was going to write a book about the state, he was going to write a book about taxation and all the things that went through taxation. But as he often does, and in many significant ways, what he does is to say, well, if I'm going to deal with it later, I'm not going to deal with it here. So he leaves his taxes to one side, so he doesn't even mention taxes in Volume 1 of Capital. Some of the money goes in the form of industrial profit, which is the profit that goes to the original producer who has taken the money capital and put it into production to create the commodity. But some of that is shared with other capitalists. Merchants assist, as it were, in the sale of the goods, and so they require a profit and take a cut. Some of it goes in the form of rent to landlords, and some of it goes in the form of interest to bankers and financiers. So the surplus value and the value get split up into these different forms. And these different forms are then form together a vast pool of money from which some money is extracted to return through reinvestment to become money capital and to complete the circle all over again. Some of it, however, is taken off because the bourgeoisie needs to live and not only work a consumer demand, but state has expenditures. So there's a consumption link which forms the consumer effective demand, which realizes the value, helps realize the value in money form. So this is the general framework which Marx sets up. And I want to start out by pointing out to you that the 3 volumes of Capital occupy different aspects of this totality. This is the core totality that Marx had in mind when he was writing. And the first volume deals with production, takes you up to the point of realization, and then declares throughout the whole of Volume 1 that the capitalist never has a problem selling the product. All commodities, he said, exchange at their value. So there is no difficulty of realization. It's automatic. The distribution just is simply the wages versus the aggregate profit, and that's, again, a simple matter, not to be, and is not complicated. So Marx basically then treats Volume 1 as just simply this passage on the center here of production up to realization. Volume 2 takes up the question of realization. And this question of realization is more problematic. But Marx then assumes certain things about the production, which are rather problematic. But nevertheless, Volume 2 then deals with this concept of realization. And he makes clear in the Grundrisse that production and realization, or valorization and realization, form what he calls a contradictory unity. That is, you can't have one without the other, and that contradictory unity is fundamental and foundational for the value in motion and the circulation of that value. Distribution is the theme of Volume 3. But Marx makes lots of assumptions in Volume 3 about what's going on in Volumes 1 and Volumes 2, and in fact he holds constant many of the elements that are very dynamic in Volumes 1 and Volumes 2, just as Volume 2 assumed that there's no technological change, which of course is one of the big themes of Volume 1. So these 3 components form the core of Marx's arguments in the 3 volumes of Capital. And it is my contention that if we want to understand Marx's theory of capital, we have to read all 3 volumes of Capital, which is a problem because Volume 1 is a beautifully written book, and for people who get into Marx, they revel in reading it. Volume 2 is the biggest bore you've ever come across, and it takes a lot of time to get through it and figure out what the hell is going on and why he's doing the things he's doing, but it's absolutely crucial because it's all about the realization. Volume 3 is a chaos and a mishmash of all sorts of things which are going on, many of which are fascinating and interesting, but no systematic way is really proposed to try to put it all together. So our task, it seems to me, in the current conjuncture, is to ask some questions about the totality, to think about how to complete what was an incomplete vision on Marx's part, and in the process, I think, try to then ask some questions about to what degree do the ideas that come out of this totality, this functioning of this totality, help us to explain something about our current circumstance. But before I get into that, I want to draw attention to some of the, if you like, contextual conditions under which this process of circulation takes place. These are conditions that Marx frequently refers to and clearly acknowledges as being terribly important, but they're not the focus of his inquiry. And what I want to convey to you, both about the different volumes of Capital, but also about what Marx is doing as a whole, is that Marx isolates a particular subject of inquiry and goes into it in depth at the same time as he acknowledges the historical importance of many of the contextual conditions under which this circulation is taking place. For instance, at the very bottom of this diagram, I put production, reproduction, and destruction of space, place, and nature. And recognize that Marx frequently talks about the way in which free gifts of nature are extracted from nature by capital for nothing, and they become an important part of the means of production which flow into the system. Now, these free gifts of nature then rest upon what Marx calls a metabolic relation to nature. And that metabolic relation is, of course, the environmental question. And it's the one where there's a great deal of struggle going on right now, and a great deal of significance has to be attached to it. But nature for Marx is not a primitive, constant nature. Nature is something that's constantly being transformed and produced by human action. And it has been produced and transformed through ages. And therefore, Marx talks of a second nature. That is, that nature which is being produced and constructed. And increasingly, of course, under capital, it's being produced and constructed under capital to make physical conditions and environmental conditions which are favorable to the reproduction of capital. And this making of the land and the making of and the production of nature becomes a very vital link in the history of how this particular circulation process operates. But Marx doesn't go into this in any great detail. Similarly, when we're talking about the production of places like cities and urbanization and villages and towns and regions and all the rest of it, these play a very important role in the history of capital, and they are produced through human action and transformed so that space relations are undergoing constant reconfiguration as we have new technologies for moving over space. And Marx speaks rather movingly in the Grundrisse about the annihilation of space through time. And actually, when we get phrases that I often use, like time-space compression, that idea comes out of Volume 2 of Capital, as well as out of the Grundrisse, and it's about the annihilation of space through time. And so you get all of these kinds of transformations are occurring in the environmental conditions under which capital circulates. The same thing occurs at the top of the diagram when we're talking about the production, reproduction, and destruction of human nature and culture. And Marx again talks about the free gifts of human nature, the way in which the ideas and the capacities and powers and intelligence and so on of a labor force are something which is produced, as he puts it, from centuries and centuries of accumulation of knowledge and understanding and all the rest of it. And those are free gifts which the laborer brings to the labour process, which the capitalist appropriates. And as Marx talks about this, it appropriates it in such a way to make it appear as if they are constructs of capital rather than free gifts of nature. So these free gifts of human nature and of nature are of that sort that they are important contextual conditions. And these important contextual conditions, in this case, play a very important role through the construction of wants, needs, and desires. You cannot have an effective demand for consumer goods without a population that wants, needs, and desires your goods. And the history of the transformation of wants, needs, and desires is an important part of capital's history. Marx talks about this 2 or 3 times at some length in the Grundrisse as well as in Capital, but says, okay, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but it is there, and it is something that we need to know about and something we need to take very considerable interest in. So the construction of wants, needs, and desires also is something which is not neutral in relationship to the dynamics of capital accumulation. Capital often goes out and tries to construct wants, needs, and desires, and it has a variety of ways by which it does it. Of course, you have the madmen of advertising that try to persuade you to wants, needs, and desires of all sorts. But there's a much deeper way in which this happens. It happens, for example, by the construction of a distinctive way of life. My favorite example of that would be the suburbanization of the United States after 1945. You create a suburban environment. Most of the population has no choice if they're going to have a decent house and a decent living environment except to go to the suburbs. But if you go to the suburbs, then you're going to get a lot of constructed wants, needs, and desires, whether you like it or not. You need an automobile. You need a refrigerator. You need all of those kinds of things. You need a lawnmower because, you're going to have a lawn and all that sort of stuff. So actually the construction of wants, needs, and desires is a very complex process in which a construction of a way of life, and that construction is done physically and it's also advertised. So if you go back and you look at all of the sort of sitcoms of the 1950s and 1960s, they were all about celebrating the suburban lifestyle. I Love Lucy, the Brady Bunch, all that kind of stuff. And that, in a sense, starts to set the standard as to what a lifestyle should be about, what wants, needs, and desires should be. And the formation of these wants, needs, and desires, then, is a very significant aspect of this history. But again, it's something that Marx does not actually take a great deal of care to deal with in any detail. He leaves it for us to talk about the significance of those aspects. Now, this system, then, that Marx sets up in the 3 volumes of Capital, which really pivot around these 3 red moments in the diagram, which is valorization, realization, and distribution. This system is different from the hydrological cycle in a number of very significant ways. To begin with, it's not a cycle. The hydrological cycle has a source of energy, which is incoming radiation, which fluctuates a little bit, but is fairly constant. The amount of heat that remains trapped because of greenhouse gases is changing, but nevertheless, it's more or less a cyclical kind of form. But Marx makes very clear that this is not a cycle we're dealing with. We're dealing with a spiral. And a spiral is a very different system. It is one which is constantly growing, building. And it must constantly grow and build for one very simple reason, that at the core of this lies this question of the production and appropriation of surplus value. That is the profit. There is more at the end of the day than there was at the beginning of the day. The system expands. It has to expand. If it doesn't expand, there's zero profit. Therefore, it would stop. So this system is a spiral. Now, we have a very interesting way of using the word spiral. We talk about things spiraling out of control. It's a great slang expression. If you ask somebody how you're doing and they say, man, I'm spiraling, you know they're in trouble. So spiral is something which Hegel called a bad infinity. It's a bad infinity, as opposed to a virtuous infinity, which is the cycle. And it's that contrast between a bad infinity of the spiral, which is always getting into trouble in some way or other, that says that capital, by definition, this process is going to get itself into trouble. And it's going to get into trouble because it has to spiral, and it has to spiral further out more. Now, how it does so in time and space, I could not incorporate into this diagram, but it is obviously going to be very much the case. So that's the first point I would want to make. The second point that I think differentiates this from the hydrological cycle is, where does the energy come from to keep this process going? Now, if you read volume 1 of Capital, you're pretty clear what the engine is. The engine is entrepreneurs, the capitalist entrepreneur or capitalist corporation that is profit-seeking and goes out there and tries to earn a profit. And it takes the money and it tries to earn a profit. So it's the entrepreneur, the classic entrepreneur, who goes out there and uses the money to make more money. And it is therefore the greed or the ambition or whatever of that kind of capitalist that drives this system. But that's not the only source, because when you go to volume 2, you'll see there has to be another source. And that other source is there because if a situation arose where, at the end of this kind of first part of the process, you got to realization and there was no want, need, or desire for a commodity, or no want, need, and desire backed by ability to pay, then you wouldn't be able to sell your commodity. And if you can't sell your commodity, you get something called not value. So not value faces you right in the face at the moment of realization. Marx assumes that away in volume 1 of Capital. There is always going to, everything exchanges its value. You can never have not value. But at the very first section of volume 1, he says, if the capitalist gets to the point of realization and nobody wants, needs, or can afford a commodity, then there is no value. So value is potentially there from production. It's only actually there at the point of realization. And that's why Marx is saying you can't analyze this system without looking at the contradictory unity between production and realization. Now, if that's the case, and the possibility exists for there to be zero opportunity for profit at the point of realization, then this system comes to an end. It stops. And there have been historical moments when the profit rate has become so low and profits are not to be had. So what do capitalists do? They stop producing. They stop investing. They have to. There's no point. Now, if a situation of that sort occurs, maybe something must be done to create demand where there was none before. How is that done? Well, there's a little line there that says state expenditures. You use state expenditures. That is, you go for the Keynesian solution. There's no market there, so what do? You go in and you create the market. And this is what, in effect, happened after 1945. That, in effect, the state stepped in and started to do things like finance the interstate highway system and suburbanization and all those kinds of things, create a demand, an effective demand, and the effective demand worked. Capital got back to work and had a very high rate of profit because the state was actually, managing the demand in such a way as to get the whole thing going again. If the state had not done that in 1945, there was a very real possibility that the United States would have fallen back into depression conditions of the 1930s, which would have not been very pleasant for the capitalist class. Because if that had happened, you had a force, a lot of unemployed ex-servicemen coming back who knew how to fire guns and things, and you'd been in alliance with the Soviet Union and things like that, and then there was a real problem in 1945, potentially. So they did classically what everybody does, what Louis Bonaparte did back in Second Empire and all the rest of it. That is, you repressed the left through McCarthyism. You got rid of all of the left thinkers you could possibly find. And you really sort of did it politically, but politically it wouldn't work unless you had a very vibrant economy. And the only way you could have a vibrant economy was by state effective demand. But if you create an effective demand, you've got to actually find a way to channel it so that it actually gets to people, which meant that you had to empower workers and you had to have higher wages, and which meant you had to have higher taxation on the rich. Now, there's a very funny story which is told these days, which says high taxation is negative for profit rates. Go back and look at the highest tax rate after 1945. At some points, it was high as 90% on the very top tax brackets. It was never less than around 75% between 1945 and 1982. And the rate of growth during that period was very high. So high tax rates on the rich and high growth very much went together during this period. Now, since then, of course, it's gone the other way around. The tax rates have come down, and there's been an attack upon working class living standards and all the rest of it. What happens? Well, the rich have got richer, okay, but the growth rate, the aggregate growth rate, has been much, much lower than it was between 1945 and 1975. So here's, if you like, the story of those years. That's one of the ways in which you can actually set things up through this system, is to pump demand into the consumer effective demand so that there's enough there for the realization to take place. But there's a third force which is significant, because if the state is going to jack up the demand, it has to get the money from somewhere. But if its only source of income is taxes, taxes at a time of recession are going to go down. So the state is going to have less and less wherewithal in order to jack up this system in a system going down. So you're going to get into a downward spiral unless there's something else that can enter into the picture. And that something else is, of course, debt finance. You borrow from the banks. So there's another source, that is, within the field of distribution, there are all sorts of mechanisms available in which money can somehow or other be pushed, not only into investment, but money can be pushed into effective demand. And how that push occurs is, I think, very important to look at, because the third source of energy in this economic system is what I call the state finance nexus, which is the connectivity between state and finance, which is represented most clearly by an alliance between the Treasury Department and the central bank. And I always found it fascinating. In 2007, 2008, when the crisis hit after September 15th, 2008, and Lehman Brothers was going under, who was it came on the television and told us what we had to do? The president disappeared, probably went and cut Bush down in, Congress ran down every rabbit hole they could possibly find, because nobody knew what to do. Who knew what to do? It was Ben Bernanke, and it was Hank Paulson, Secretary of the Treasury. And they came on television with a little piece of paper, 3 pages long, and says, this is what we're going to do. That's your state finance nexus in action. They know what they're doing. They know what they've got to do. And they said, basically, you've got to bail out the banks, because if you don't bail out the banks, that's the end of capitalism. As Marx pointed out, if you don't bail out banks when they're in trouble, you're in real serious trouble in terms of capitalism. So the state finance nexus, then, exists in this field of distribution. And it's a very powerful force. But it debt finances. And since it debt finances, it's actually doing something which is rather akin to what happens when you fail to realize your value. It's creating value in advance of value. Debt finance is a claim on future labor. Actually, money is a claim on future labor, but the future is so short that we're not worried. But debt finance is a claim on future labor. And it is therefore a negative form. It is what we call anti-value, or I call anti-value. It's anti-value, which is created, and it has to be redeemed by value production. So what, in effect, this system has to do in order to stabilize itself is that if the entrepreneurial spirit is not being fulfilled, if the realization of value is in trouble, the state finance nexus steps in and creates a form of anti-value by creating future claims for current expenditures. So you mortgage the future to the present. And that's what you do. And that, therefore, becomes one of the big centers driving this process. Now, there are many elements to this. It's not only the state finance nexus, because there are many elements that come together in the field of distribution to create a pressure to produce. And this creation of the pressure comes for all sorts of reasons. I have a pension fund. What are pension funds obliged to do? They're obliged to take the money which you put in your pension, and they're under a fiduciary obligation to try to use it in such a way as to increase it. So they take my pension money and they push it down into money capital. And if there's nobody's down there amongst the money capitalists who's asking for it, then you go and you push somebody and say, you've got to ask for it. There have been times when you read the financial press and it says the banks are so full of surplus money, and the pension funds have so much surplus cash, they don't know what to do with it, so they're knocking on doors saying, please, for God's sake, come up with some way of spending this. So it then says that the impulse for the growth and the impulse has these three places of origin of the power to make the system dynamic. And I would like to suggest that historically, the first, which is covered in Volume 1 of Capital, was historically probably very important relative to the others. But by the time you get to the 1930s, the second, state expenditures, became very significant. Since 1973, I want to argue that the main source has been the debt, and it's been constructed through the state finance nexus through the field of distribution. And that is what is now putting the big pressure to keep this system moving. But notice something. Debt is a claim on future labor. It therefore forecloses the future. Therefore, what's happening in effect is that right now we are foreclosing the future. And this happens in a private way as well as in a public way. Since most of you in this audience have probably experienced the joy of having student debt, you will doubtless know what I mean. Part of your future is foreclosed because you've got to redeem that debt before you can do anything else. And the conditions of redemption are getting harsher and harsher and harsher. And it then becomes very difficult to imagine a different future from the one that's already preordained by the structure of debt activities. Now, what this would suggest is that there should therefore be all sorts of indicators which will show that rising indebtedness is one of the key features of global economy right now. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But there are other features of this system which, for me, are very important to look at. For example, I've already mentioned wants, needs, and desires, and the restructuring of wants, needs, and desires permanently on a certain kind of basis. The restructuring of those wants, needs, and desires has to be loosely linked, if you like, with the foreclosure of the future. But there are other features of this dynamic. One of which is that this dynamic does not proceed at the same speed. That is, throughout history, this system has moved faster and faster and faster. It is speeding up. Speeding up for the very simple reason, as Marx explains in Volume 2 of Capital. The turnover time of capital is crucial to profitability. If I can turn over my capital 3 times in a year, I get 3 times as much profit than if I turn it over once in a year. Therefore, turning things over faster and faster and faster becomes very much more significant. That means that actually, on that basis, you would need to accelerate all sorts of aspects of this social system. One of them that needs to be accelerated is consumption. And it's not simply about consumerism, it's about the speed with which consumption takes place and the speed of turnover and consumption. If capital produced goods that lasted 100 years, then what you would see is that there would be no market. So capital likes to produce goods which are consumed instantaneously. And one of those goods which it produces instantaneously is spectacle. So more and more we rely upon the production of spectacle. So even politics becomes spectacle, which we consume. So the consumptionism and the forms of consumption, the forms of daily life, therefore become extremely accelerated. And this acceleration takes a toll. Some people enjoy it, some people don't. I mean, I'm fond of kind of pointing out that when I came into academia, it was considered to be bad manners to publish more than 2 books in a lifetime. Well, go tell that to any dean these days. See what they say. You've got to produce, at least a book a year, or, people think you died. Now, I happen to be quite good at doing that. But a lot of people aren't, and I know people who struggle. I mean, my first book, big book, Limits to Capital, took 10 years to write. Now, you can't write books that take 10 years anymore because you'd be thrown out. Some research assessment exercise or something like that, some assessment would come up and say, this is a completely useless academic, they haven't produced 5 articles in 3 years in, refereed journals and all that kind of stuff, kind of. But how did this come into academia? Well, it's all about the turnover time of knowledge and turnover time of... So it's affecting everything. Daily life. Marx took the view that actually disposable time was one of the great virtues and values that we should strive for when we're looking for, what a socialist world should look like. Disposable time. Time when there was nothing you needed to do. Most people find they have less disposable time now, even though there are all these time-saving innovations. So there's less and less disposable time, even though the innovations are there to make more and more disposable time, because the dynamic is such that this whole system is the bad infinity. And we're caught in the bad infinity, and it is speeding up. So this is, again, one of the features of this system, that you imagine this circulation process speeding, speeding, speeding. So I use this then to try to talk about various dynamics within the capitalist system. And I just want to mention a couple of these. First, this whole system, of course, is weighed down by struggles and contention. There's class struggle at the point of production. There's class struggle over the value of labor power and all the rest of it. On the left, we're very familiar with that idea and those struggles. We're less familiar with the idea of the struggles that occur around realization of value, but actually they're just as important, because realization of value is where a lot of capitalists are making their money these days. I always use the example of the pharmaceutical industry. Pfizer increased its drug prices last year by 27%. This is actually appropriation of value at the point of realization. And of course, we know what's going on in terms of housing markets and prices of land, all these kinds of things. So there's lots of struggles over realization, and the politics of realization are actually very, very complicated. But as Marx points out, realization does not involve the class relation between capital and labor. It's about relations between buyers and sellers. It's a different kind of politics. But it's part of what anti-capitalist politics is about. So anti-capitalist politics is not simply about class struggle in production. It's also about the social and political struggles that go on around realization. The struggles that go on around the question of our relation to nature. The struggles that are going on right now over the question of what kind of human nature, what kind of human beings are we, what kind of human nature, and can we preserve culture and cultural struggles, and what's going on with indigenous groups and all the rest of it in terms of the destruction of their cultures. The struggle going on over, in other words, you can construct from this all of those points which are tension points where there's some sort of political struggle going on, some of them extremely intense, including struggles, of course, in social reproduction and in and around the reproduction of labor power, but social reproduction more generally. So with a map of this kind, you can kind of say, okay, there's going to be struggles all over it. And you can start to think about how they all relate or do not relate, how they have a different structure. All of them may be anti-capitalist, but they're not class struggles in the classical sense. They're a mixture of struggles of various kinds, which says there's something about the politics of the contemporary moment, has to acknowledge these different forms of struggle across this map and recognize that they take these different forms and cannot be easily integrated into each other, even as they are basically, in many instances, all anti-capitalist and therefore part and parcel of an anti-capitalist movement. There are other things that can be said. And these things have to do with explaining some of the dynamics of what's going on around us. I mentioned that, well, we've got a situation in which debt has become more and more significant. We have a couple of graphs following. This is the total household, combined household, corporate and state debt, which has been set up since 1950. And you see that this has been growing exponentially up until the hiccup of 2007, 2008, but it's grown since. It's not stopped. The crisis of 2007, 2008, when you map it into this system and say, what was the response to the crisis? One part of the world responded by taking state expenditures and spending them like crazy. That was China. China just threw everything it possibly could into production after 2007, 2008. A vast infrastructural program, absorbed about 27 million people into a labor force who were unemployed, stabilized their own economy, but in the process, stabilized the global economy. Because all of the raw materials that the Chinese needed for that infrastructural program had to come from somewhere. So extractions picked up in Latin America, extractions picked up in Australia, extractions picked up all over the place at a very rapid rate, with disastrous environmental consequences and for indigenous rights and all the rest of it, but nevertheless it saved global capitalism. If the Chinese had not done that, capitalism would have gone back into the 1930s. So China was absolutely crucial, and it was building whole cities, building high-speed rail networks. They had, in 2007, China had 0 lines of high-speed rail. It's now got 15,000 miles of high-speed rail. And you can zoom from Shanghai to, Beijing on a train and get there in 5 hours. So this is something that went on around the crisis. But it was debt-financed. And here you see the top consequence is China overall debt to GDP ratio, which stood around, what was that? 144% of GDP in 2007. Now it's 245% of GDP. Now, if any country had that level of debt and they were indebted in dollars, they would have been disciplined by the IMF a long time ago. The Chinese have not been disciplined by the IMF because their debt is in their own currency. And you can't go bankrupt in your own currency. You just issue more of it. But that debt load is huge for China, huge. Some of the hugest in the world right now. But if you build, then you've got to actually get people to buy. And if people can't buy, then you have to lend them the money to buy. So the bottom graph deals with household debt to GDP, which is mainly the borrowings, which have grown since 2013, quarter by quarter, expanding from 33% of GDP up to sort of 42% of GDP in 2016. And that is to buy houses. So you're lending money to people to build houses, and actually a quarter of the growth of China's GDP has been in housing construction alone. But if you build all those houses, you've got to give people money to buy it. So you lend them money. So the indebtedness of households in China has been soaring. It's not yet close to the United States, but this is moving very, very, very fast. So this is a problem, but this also has physical consequences. This is one of my favorite graphs. The bottom line, the little blue line, is the consumption of cement in the United States over 100 years. The red bars are the consumption of cement in China. And as you see, there's a slight disparity between the two. In other words, China got out of the threat of the Great Depression and saved itself from kind of social unrest and unemployment by actually spreading cement everywhere. And you then say to yourself, actually, this is not the first time this has happened. This is what the US did when it built the interstate highway system. This is what actually Haussmann did in Paris after the crash of 1848. He got back full employment by rebuilding the boulevards, this kind of thing. But that was small potatoes compared with what Robert Moses did to New York, and that was even smaller potatoes compared with what the Chinese have done here. This is what I mean about the spiral. This is what I mean about the bad infinity. You know, what Haussmann did put a certain amount of stress on the environment, and what Moses did, a certain amount of stress on the environment. Now you've got a level of stress, which is, then you wonder, in 30 years' time, if we have another bout of this and we increase the scale at that rate, what on earth is everything going to look like? And China's run into all kinds of problems over, you know, even building sand is becoming a problem. So the resource constraints are getting very, very significant. So this is something that is there, and it's, like I say, it's not only cement. You've got to deal with, okay, steel production. It's fairly flat until China got into the business to save itself, and look what happens. Okay? And this is copper consumption. A nice kind of one of those spiraling graphs, and then the China is leading the way with huge amounts of consumption of copper. So this is, I think, a process which is going on right now through the way in which that system I'm talking about is being powered by this debt finance. And this debt finance has become critical. And it's leading us into a situation of debt peonage, that actually the world is in hock, to the point where in order to redeem these levels of debt, we're going to have to actually commit ourselves to developmentalism and developmental project in order to retire that debt. It's either that or some revolutionary transformation which actually eliminates the debt. Now, I know there are all these nice proposals which kind of say, yeah, well, you know, we can have a jubileum like they did in ancient Sumer or something like that. That entirely misreads the nature of the situation. The situation is you can't do something like that for all sorts of social reasons. For example, all the world's pension funds are part of the state finance nexus. My pension fund is in there. And if we did a jubileum, I'd lose all my pension money. And all the pension funds are part of this kind of thing. So the whole society is caught in a thing of wants, needs, and desires which have already been pre-structured, prefigured, foreclosed upon. And I think the term foreclosure is a very good term because it's not only the foreclosure on houses, it's the foreclosure of a future. The future is already done. It's there. We've got to redeem it. That's our only task right now. This is debt peonage. This is debt slavery. This is the point that capital has got to. And this is the point where it seems to me that we need to start to think very clearly about what the alternatives might be. And here, too, we find ourselves in this very peculiar situation, where the one thing we're not supposed to do is to actually question the nature of capital. When we look at all the reasons why, this country is in trouble, it's immigrants, or it's this, or it's that, or something else. The one thing we don't talk about absolutely as being the core of the problem is this bad infinity that we're locked into, and this bad infinity needs to be redressed, pulled back, somehow or other. And as you see from the graphs, it's not as if it's slackening off. In fact, it's accelerating. And part of the problem here, of course, is the distribution. And it comes back to the distribution question. The distribution is such that actually capital is doing very badly, actually. But the capitalist class is doing very well. And it's that contradiction, that paradox, which lies at the heart of the fact that politics is unable to solve or even address any of these problems because politics is dominated by big money. Big money is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, more and more powerful. And while we're seeing signs of some sort of populist kind of response on the left, most of the populist response, if it's going anywhere, is going on the right, and big capital is very happy with that. Stops anything going towards the left. So the politics of the situation are such that they're connected into the way in which the capitalist class is doing very well, even though capital is doing very badly, and the rest of the population is doing, hardly well at all, except acquiring more and more debt. And that has been going on since the 1970s. I mean, the debt economy has been growing, as I show in those graphs, steadily since the 1970s. And it's now got to the point where we're actually, right now, we're borrowing this year to pay off last year's debt. This is Ponzi finance. And as we all know about Ponzi finance, it blows up at a certain point. It's Ponzi finance without a Bernie Madoff at the top. It's sponsored very largely through the state finance nexus, because that's the only way in which they can replicate this system. So the replication of this system, then, is doing it and replicating it by foreclosing on the future and by committing us to a future that has no real future option in it. This is why I would argue we all have to start to think anti-capitalist. And we have to think it in a way which recognizes across that map of the circulation of capital the different points of struggle and acknowledge all those points of struggle have to be knitted together, not in a unity, false unity, but put together. Let me leave it there. Thanks very much.
Well, I really misspoke to say that David Harvey will not give us only a narrative which is bleak. So I was wrong. We'll take questions. Please keep them short. There are two mics right here. We don't have a lot of time, and we welcome your questions. Well, I welcome them for David Harvey.
One of the striking things, I thought the talk was brilliant, especially the bits about anti-value and, and debt. The first two charts are very striking in coming from a geographer, because what drops out in the second chart is the land, all of the place, the space. I mean, there are no banks or factories, and I was hoping you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, my friend Miguel and I have been trying to struggle with how to do this in a picturesque way. I had a fantasy, actually, of creating a big poster, you know, like yay big. We also had a fantasy of creating an animation. We still might do it, right? I think it'd be a very good way to do it. As it is, this is a skeletal system which shows you the basic links that have to be connected. And I was most concerned to try to bring together the idea of production, realization, distribution, and see them in as a dynamic relation and within a totality. That was my initial aim, and I think that that's what the diagram effectively illustrates. Putting in, you know, banks and you know, and how do you actually diagrammatically represent foreclosed students, you know, debt? You know, it's kind of it's possible to do. So I think there's some interesting challenges here, and since the New School has a very good program on these sorts of things, I'd like to invite everybody to have a go at creating some way of doing this, and we're certainly going to be working, I think, on it in the future.
Yeah, hi. My question is kind of along similar lines. I'm just wondering, like, you know, in terms of like fleshing out the skeletal structure that you just described, like, which like data points or dimensions do you think are like the most important of like the kind of imperfect windows through which we could see the real movement of capital? Because I'm interested in like data visualization techniques and how kind of conventional data visualization can be joined up with like this structure that you're proposing here.
Well, I think the point of seeing this as a totality is to recognize that any intervention at any one point can be counteracted by countervailing forces at another point. For example, if I can go back. For example, Bernie Sanders says he wants a minimum wage of $15 an hour. There are many people now who, on the left and on the right, are saying we should have a universal basic income. What that does, of course, is to actually increase worker consumer demand. More money in the worker's pocket. The assumption is that this is going to make life better off for the workers. But actually what happens is you raise the minimum wage, people have more money in their pocket, and they get to the point of realization, and the drug companies come in and take it all away. Or the landlords raise the rent, and it's all gone. So by understanding that if you have a politics which only concentrates on raising the minimum wage, and you don't control what's happening at the point of realization by having rent controls and controls on speculation on housing, and stop the pharmaceutical companies arbitrarily raising drug prices, and you know, and the telephone company putting extra charges on for God knows what, and the credit card companies doing the same sort of thing. Unless you do something about the politics of realization, then it's not clear to me that raising the minimum wage or giving a you know, universal basic income is going to do any good whatsoever. And in fact, you could argue that it would be much better for people to leave the wages alone for a moment and really have a big attack upon housing speculation and what's happening to housing prices and rent prices. And pretty much everywhere in the world I've been right now, you know, moderate income people are being priced out of all of the accessible housing markets in the major cities. I mean, I was in China just last week, and you know, Shanghai has this problem. You know, London has this problem. New York has this problem. So by looking at the totality, you would say immediately to yourself, what can happen in this movement that would countermand something else? So you don't get simplistic about it and say, well, everybody's going to be better off, the workers are going to be better off if they all have a basic minimum wage of $15 instead of what they have now. Well, the answer is they may be or they may not be. And my guess is, given the way things have been working, that they're not going to be, that it's all going to be taken at the point of realization by predatory behavior at the point of realization. And while I didn't use it, I often talk about what I call accumulation by dispossession. There's a lot of dispossession which is going on at the point of realization in housing markets, predatory behaviors, stealing, thieving, and some people have got caught, but, you know, most people have had some experience of this sort of thing. So if that's going to go on at the point of realization, then we should be paying much more attention to the politics of realization. So when somebody kind of says, well, what's the key point in here? The typical Marxist solution has always been to say, well, the production is what really matters. I get that again and again and again. And I'm kind of saying, I'm not saying production doesn't matter. Of course it matters. It's absolutely crucial. But if your politics is solely concentrated on production, then you're going to miss out on all this other stuff, which is very, very, very significant. And you're not going to, and you're going to find that the politics of production doesn't go anywhere because, you know, realization questions come up and all the rest of it. So I think that, so to me, the point of the totality is to say I don't want to privilege any one point at all, any one moment in this process, because it's the question of the totality. Now, what kind of politics could actually address the totality? Well, first off, you've got to have an agreement that that's the totality we want to address, and then secondly, we've got to have a way of thinking about, well, all right, how are we going to reconfigure distributional arrangements, and how are we going to reconfigure and diminish some of the pressures that come out of the state-finance nexus to control this system. You notice, for example, I mean, the question of pension funds is a very interesting one, extremely interesting on this, because for a long time we're always being told we should privatize pension funds and we should get rid of Social Security. Well, the advantage of Social Security is it doesn't actually put pressure on getting a fiduciary rate of return and all the rest of it. So the push by the right wing to privatize all pension fund is going to increase that pressure. Well, we can do it the other way by nationalizing all pension funds and turning it into the equivalent of a vast Social Security system, which is a pay-as-you-go system. And then you wouldn't have all this pressure coming from pension funds. You just wouldn't. I mean, my pension fund is messing around in Latin America, you know, engaging in land grab politics in Latin America. And okay, we send protest letters and all the rest of it to TIA because it doesn't do much good. But that's the sort of thing that's going on. The big university endowments like Harvard has been terrible, and you know. So again, the financing of higher education should not be based on endowments. It should not be based on the financing of pensions. So you can cut, if you could cut all those things down by nationalizing pension funds, saying to universities basically give up your endowments in return for, you know, it's a tax revenue-based income, which would be an interesting way of equalizing some of the expenditures on universities, those sorts of things. In other words, there is a politics that goes with this, which would say, well, we're all agreed that actually we've got to diminish this pressure that's coming from the state finance nexus and the distributional arrangements. We've got to diminish that, and how do we do it? Well, there are ways to go about it. So those are things that now there could be counteracting things go on elsewhere, and so then you have to address them. So I would want to sort of think about the totality of it and try to think of politics accordingly.
Yes. It seems to me that the system that you're describing is not at all capitalism.
Is what?
It's not at all capitalism, it's just feudalism. And actually even worse than feudalism, because back in the feudal days, at least the feudal lord would provide some security to the serfs. Today, we pay all these massive unproductive rents to all this privileged class, the rentier class, and we get nothing in return. And all the vacuum is filled again, as you said, on the unrealized future labor. So that's feudalism on steroids. Wow. So I think the left should own, I think, this ideological mistake to be calling to be handing capitalism its victory by instead of calling them feudal lords, you call them capitalists, and then you hand them, basically give them a carte blanche to say to the 80% of the populace, which is somehow, this system somehow works, you know, either in a comfortable way or a semi-comfortable way, to think that these pseudo-capitalists, they're entitled to the rents they extract. So you hand them the victory on a platter. And don't you think that the left should stop calling that system capitalist? We should start from there. And maybe that would increase the class conscience that basically all of us workers here actually were enslaved and were part of the same team, instead of playing, you know, idiotic partisan politics, which mean nothing. You know, and I think that maybe is going to increase the front of the disenfranchised. Yeah. My question would be on education, because education is the key. Right. Sorry. The first one was comment. Sorry. Yeah. So on education, shouldn't all education be free?
Yeah, of course.
Be free and. Hold on. No, not public that Bernie says. What Bernie says is a big mistake. Even Harvard should be free, yeah. And Harvard should be paid by, let's say, the student will commission 3% of his lifelong earnings back to its alma mater, and it should be funded that way. And if I get something of value, it's going to materialize, and Harvard would have plenty of funds to fund its operations. If it's bankrupt, it should go bankrupt. Thank you.
Yeah, Michael Hudson likes to talk about this whole system as the new feudalism. I'm a bit resistant to doing that for a variety of reasons. I think the class structure is radically different from feudalism, and I think the issues are rather different. But I agree with you entirely that there are many elements of this system, including the debt peonage, it's a form of slavery, really, that have feudal overtones. But I'm a bit reluctant to call it that. On education, yeah, I mean, in the acknowledgements to the recent book, I said, you know, I want to acknowledge the fact that my education was free right the way through to my PhD. And that occurred back in Britain in the 1950s. And if it could be done in Britain in the 1950s, I don't see why it couldn't be done worldwide right now. And I think that's, you know, to me, it's an elementary kind of conclusion I would have about many of these elements, like education, healthcare, should not be subject to the commodity calculus. They should not be bought and sold as commodities. They should not be marketized. So this is you know, there are many elements of that kind. Yeah.
I wish we could take another question. Unfortunately, our time is up. My apologies. Before I thank David Harvey, I just wanted to let you all know that there is a continuation of our public lecture series tomorrow and on Wednesday. Tomorrow is Professor Anthony Appia on honor, citizenship, and the law. And on Wednesday, Mick Tausig, Rastelli the juggler, or what are the Turks doing in Walter Benjamin's thesis on history and in the bodily consciousness, a short title. I leave you with those anti-capitalist notions, and RSVP is the only way to go, please. We have never done it that way before, but this year we've really had to because of the size. So please do RSVP. And let us thank David Harvey.
Thank you.